Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H event space. You are tuned into Leica Stories. Today we are in conversation with photographer and videographer Adam Moore. Adam, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. This one today is going to be, it's like 50-50. I feel like we're going to be talking about watches as much as we're going to be talking about cameras today. All right. Let me get
Hey,
this up here. All right. So, Adam,
I can hear me.
again, thank you for coming on. Like I said, watches are going to be the conversation of the day. I know that's your passion, but I do want to start it out with photography. What got you started? Where did the love for photography begin?
Derek, I'm hearing a playback of what you're saying.
Oh, okay. If you're getting a loop back, it is probably so. If you have a window open, any internet windows open, if you have
Oh,
this up,
yeah,
close that
my
off.
apologies.
No worries. We've dealt with it before on our side. Does that sound better? And if you have the B&H event page up open, it'll cause a loop back as well.
Sorry, folks. There we are.
All worked out?
Yep,
Wonderful. There we
technology.
go. Take two. No, Adam, welcome again.
Hi, Derek. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
No, no problem at all. Like I was saying, watches are going to be as much the conversation today as cameras. You're a big watch guy. See, we got all the watches behind. A lot of your
Oh,
work
yeah.
deals with that. I was just saying, what got you into photography, but I kind of want to know what came first. Was it photography or watches?
It was photography for sure. I went to college for photography. I did darkroom photography in high school even, so it was photography first, macro photography first.
Okay, so macro, it was macro from the start.
Yeah. Yep, that's
And
always what interests me. Even in high school, I just started immediately going macro with everything. It was just what I was into.
interesting. So that was it deeper than photography? Was it kind of something where you the person that in science class always loved the days when you're in the microscope looking at stuff or
Not really necessarily. It was really just as soon as I picked up a camera, that's what I decided to do with it.
hmm. And I guess you have to see that way. I've tried macro is one of those things, and that's one of the things that fascinates me about your work is I love macro photography. But the second I put a macro lens on and I'm like, okay, because everything looks more interesting and we kind of filter out the fact that you guys make it look easy. And then when you try to do it and you're like, okay, well, why doesn't my stuff look interesting? What is it about macro that doesn't translate for everybody? Is there something like you just have to see that way, or is there certain subject matter that jumps out and leans towards macro?
I think really it probably has to do with the way that a particular photographer sees the world. In other words, what their eye likes to see, what their viewpoint is when they look through a camera. It's the way the composition that they come up with. That's really what it is that draws people, I think, towards macro photography. Obviously, I do it as a profession, and it's not only my uh, part of my love of photography, but it's also what I do for work. So it's a little bit of, this and that, right? Where I'm fortunate enough that I get to do a part of photography for my business that I actually like to do. And not every photographer does that, right? You get wedding
Mhm.
photographers who are, landscape artists on the side. You get all sorts of people out there. So that's what my brain does. It's the composition. For me, I like to explore what's a little bit closer, see the world in a different way than what our human eye can see.
And that's one of the interesting things too is the whole Leica angle. Obviously, this being a Leica hosted talk, you don't normally associate Leica with macro photographers. It's like we always think photojournalists and fashion and all that stuff. So I want to pull up my shared screen real quick because you had sent over a couple of images, and this is what got you onto the Leica system. So if you can talk a little bit about
Yeah.
these two images, I'll bounce back and forth between this and the panorama.
Yep. So in 2007, I was working in a professional camera rental store here in New York City, and I helped convince them in the rental department to get an M8 when they first came out. I was like, oh, we need like they had an M6 and several lenses, and I was like, okay, you guys need an M8. This is a thing you should get. And it was purely so that I could get it and take it out on the weekends when no one else would rent it. So one of the first things I did with it was I went on, it was on a trip in Paris, and I climbed to the top of Notre Dame, and I took these shots. I believe it was a 35 Summicron, the version 4, I believe. And it was just like, I looked at these images on my screen afterwards, and it was like something about the way that it just rendered the image. I was immediately hooked. I was like, there's something about this camera and the style of the way that it shoots, the way that it's unobtrusive. I previous to that, I owned an M6 TTL, before was shooting the M8. So I already had a few of my own lenses and things like that. But as soon as that happened, as soon as I was able to rent this M8, I immediately like started going after my own. So, but the when I go to a new place, when I go to a new city, what I do is I do landscape shots. And that way I'm going around the city, I'm going around the countryside wherever I am, and I explore that place through my lens. And it helps me get around the city, it helps me get around whatever town I'm in, especially when I'm in a foreign country. It's like, okay, let's climb to the top of Notre Dame and see what we can do, see what I can see. And from there, this started my love of digital M rangefinders.
And you've stayed with the M system, if I'm correct. I mean, is that one of your main systems? I know you went SL, SL2S, SL3. What's the main, what is your bag looking like now? What are the main setups? Which camera is used for which?
So I M10 is what I have um, in the bag for the kind of shots you just saw when I'm go to a new place. And the SL3 is the current camera that I use for pretty much all studio photography, videography. Um, I owned the CL before the SL system, and I loved it. It was fantastic. So I was, as we'll probably get into, I was going to a lot of watch trade shows, and when you're walking around all day long, you don't want to have giant amounts of gear with you. It becomes this like the first year I went to any one of these things, I brought a tripod, and I carried it one day and then left it in the room, right? It was like because people bring these entire kits with them. They've got like assistants and setups, and you have a, a 30-minute appointment with a watch brand to go over their, let's say, 10 watches that they came out with this year. And that's, you don't have 30 minutes to shoot. That's like an entire presentation that they're giving you. And then suddenly you have, 15 minutes to shoot 10 watches. And so you
Wow.
really have to sort of like hone what it is. So the CL and the macro 60 millimeter TL lens was where I started with that. And I still actually use the 60 millimeter TL lens a lot on the SL3 with to great effect.
Really? Is
Yeah.
there another macro lens or any other lens that you use in the professional work, the watch and the macro work?
So I have my trusty Canon 100 macro that sort of remains as um, the backup to the 60 millimeter TL, and it's really because I was Canon, in the studio before that, and there's not a dedicated SL macro lens yet. So I'm waiting for the day when I know that there is a dedicated one, but it's not made by Leica, right? So
Okay.
there is one for the L mount, but it's not a Leica lens. So I continue to use the Canon and the 60 millimeter. Of course, the 60 millimeter gets cropped.
Mhm.
But it's something like 36 megapixels instead of 60 or something to that effect. So it's very usable amount of, um, you know, size resolution.
Mhm.
Like,
What do
as you can
you
tell, I'm a gear nerd. So like,
I
I'm
love
like,
this. I'm like, no, this is all this stuff is interesting to me. And like I said, the macro, because it's so not macro is so niche that if you don't really know about macro, it's a whole nother world as far as the gear. And I was
Mhm.
even going to ask you what the lighting, like what kind of lighting is this all continuous lighting? When are you working with natural light? What decides that?
So when I started, going to watch collector meetups here in New York, which is really kind of how I fell into professional watch photography. I started, some friends of mine were organizing watch collector meetups, and at the time, I had started photographing a lot of jewelry for clients here in New York. And as you may know, when you get good at photographing jewelry, people are take notice from the watch side of things because watches and jewelry are very difficult to photograph because of the different reflection angles that you get. So because I was already good at jewelry, I started, and I was interested in watches. I started going to these watch collector meetups, and I was the guy in the corner in the dark bar who was bringing different lighting setups and trying to figure out what it was. And I at the time I had an M9, and I had the 90 millimeter macro with the this very small amount of basically extension tube that comes with that, so you can sort of focus a little bit closer. So here I am in the corner with it aimed down on this tiny tripod, and I had these, at first I had continuous lights until I realized that like if somebody came over and set their drink down on the table at the same time, my 3 second exposure was completely screwed. So it was like that's actually, so when you asked earlier about like can you use macro, can you use Leica for macro? I attempted to do it for fun at first with the M9. Of course, there's no live view at all with the M9. So it was literally like, okay, move it up a little bit more, move it up a little bit. Okay, here we go. And
Tedious.
get a whole bunch more extension tubes. I found on eBay these Elites New York extension tubes from some early, add-on macro system, probably one of those big like gun looking things that Leica made. And they happen to be, just regular screw mounts. So I got an adapter and I was able to essentially add extension tubes to my M9 and my 90 millimeter macro. So here I am in the corner, shooting watches in a dark bar.
Amazing. I see, and I would have thought I was gonna, because I was thinking LED. I did a little bit of jewelry years ago, earlier in my career, and yeah, it didn't work out for me. It's very difficult. And the one thing that people don't realize or may not realize about jewelry, when you're shooting people wearing jewelry, it's like being a portrait photographer. I'm like, okay, it's all about the person and the jewelry's an accessory. And it's like, no, you have to make the jewelry, it has to be an accessory, but it also has to be the standout. And for me, that was always the difficult balance of like, where does the focus go? Does the focus go on the model? Does the focus go on the jewelry? On which photo are we kind of setting up
Yeah, well,
which way?
it's like with watches, it's like, okay, how do you get the watch?
And have to look
where,
at make it look natural.
how do you look? You get a lot of these, right? You get a lot of like, oh, I'm adjusting my glasses, right? It's like, but
The cufflink fixing, and
right. And
how
so
long does that take to become natural?
Oof. Well, it's like a lot of what I do is on wrist shots without showing faces. So fortunately for me, when I'm photographing models, it's usually, I can adjust their body position much easier in that sense.
Hmm.
But a lot of my work definitely focuses on the macro. To go back to the lighting you were talking about earlier, though, you asked me what my lighting setup is. I use relatively small flashes, and I just put them up close um, to my set is very small. It's very
Okay.
compact, and that partly my set is compact because of years of going on location. Like I was talking about earlier, I was going to these watch trade shows where you have like a half of a table to do an entire watch setup. So I got really good at creating a world in a mini space while photographing macro. So it's like I can set up anywhere and get an incredible image. But when I have the opportunity, when I have more space, like I'm in my studio here in New York, when I have the space to spread out, I really can and, make a much bigger set of it. But it's all very, very much honed in that one small space. And it's less about what lighting you're using and more about your use of bounce of the light.
Okay. Yeah, because it's a lot of reflective materials. That's another thing. I mean, jewelry, even like gems, it's easier because you're not really catching a good reflection. It's more light and shadow and that contrast and variation. But you're shooting a lot of reflective faces. Does that is it more often or not that you're playing into the reflection, or is it really just a game of eliminating it? What comes from like the watch brand side? What are they looking for? How much latitude do you have to say like, hey, I might want to incorporate a little bit of a reflection or a catch light in here? Are they, how do they handle that?
Yeah, to be honest, I have a very specific outlook on what I'm trying to capture with my watch photography, and by that I mean I'm not trying to make it look perfect. I'm trying to make it look like what it actually would look like in real life. And there's a difference because you see some, it doesn't matter if it's watches or whatever products, but you see some product photography and it's this perfect thing that's been perfectly retouched sitting in this like blank space, whether it be a black background or whatever. And you'll see it almost looks like a rendering, right? It almost looks
Yeah.
like it's been the lighting is super soft, but everything that is supposed to pop is contrasty and pops. And it's like my attempt is to make the watch look the way that it does in real life. And part of that comes from being in the watch collector community where people want to see in my photos what a watch actually looks like because they want to maybe buy one for themselves, right? So it's like that has translated over into my professional work as far as what I have this specific look that when clients come to me, they often just say, we love the way your images look of the watches, so just go with that. And if they have any specific instructions, they'll tell me. But like, so mostly as far as reflections go, especially on like dials and things like that, it's more about showing what if the dial is reflective, if it's, if you have like the other day I shot a bright gold reflective dial, right? And that's like it's a whole other way, a whole other concept than if you have like a matte black dial, right? It's like the way the light hits it and what, different ways you're going to bounce the light into it or hit the light onto it is, completely changes.
I love that. And in talking about renderings, it's so true. Because I see it with camera gear a lot of times where it's like, I
Yeah,
like that
yeah.
lifestyle look. I don't want to have to zoom in and be like, wow, is this like either whoever shot this is really just technically on point, or this is just a rendering and I'm over here beating myself in the head and zooming it in and trying to find something that's not there. And I think that approach is great. You know, like you said, you want to know it's more about the material and the look, and this is reflective, this is matte, the texture and
hmm
how all that stuff is going to play when you're wearing it in real life. Now, kind of compounding on that, the accessories. Do you just have like, are you, going across and finding, hey, I see a cool spread here. I'm just gonna grab this. Or going to flea market and it's like, wow, that would look really cool. Do you have like a kit
Oh yeah.
of
Oh yeah. Oh
like
yeah.
a
Everywhere
trunk?
I go, it's like, it's like, oh, I'm happen to be visiting family up in New York, upstate New York somewhere. It's like, oh, well, let's just go into this flea market and see what's going on here this weekend, and like just finding textures. And oftentimes it's like, pieces of scrap material that somebody else is basically throwing out. Go to fabric stores and go to the remnants area and just like rummage through the like snake skin and really fine leather that's only a swatch this big, and that's perfect for macro photography. So I'll just pick those things up, and
Mhm.
that
And
changes the world.
And like anything else, I'm guessing the fact that you are an aficionado, you know watches intimately. And this isn't something where it's like, hey, I'm a jewelry photographer, I'm a watch photographer, I'm a macro photographer.
Right.
Knowing the subject matter intimately plays a huge role in knowing how you're going to characterize something or knowing kind of I'm guessing stuff to stay away from or an angle to lean into when you're photographing, especially when you're photographing in a professional capacity for commercial work and brands and whatnot. How does that play in to your vision? And when you're talking with a brand, obviously you're communicating or they know that you know the subject intimately. Does that play into the creative vision and how far you can go and what brands are going to be more hey, we're more straightforward and you know that the brand is straightforward. Can you talk a little bit about the creative process in that way?
Yes. And I'm going to start by saying, okay, let's go back to the 1700s. So in the 1700s in England, the government was having a hard time with ships running aground. And they called it the longitude problem, right? Because ships could find latitude very easily, but longitude was difficult. And as I was learning about watches and the history of watches, I fell into this world of understanding how humans have traversed the earth and been able to get around and accurately navigate from place to place. And with that, I saw some of the very earliest marine chronometer clocks that were built for ships. And seeing those things in person and understanding the history of why they were built and why an accurate clock is important brought me from the current world of commercial work and capitalist understanding of let's collect these, physical objects and what they might mean to people because they're expensive things and luxury goods. And it took me out of that idea of like, I may not like that guy over there wearing a Rolex because I have a preconceived notion of what he might do in his, in his off time or whatever. And let's get rid of all of that and let's look at the way that humans have decided to tell time over the course of the last several hundred years. And because that era of history and that understanding is very integral, well, it's not integral, it's a thing that I really enjoyed learning about. What I see in a watch is perhaps different than somebody who doesn't know that history. And, obviously we're far past all of that. And the reason we still have mechanical watches is because, it's an art form now, right? Like we have more accurate ability to tell time. We
Mm.
have quartz technology, which is far more accurate than a mechanical technology, but their mechanical watches are essentially tiny mechanical art. And I see a way of looking at the interpretation, the development, the design that's very specifically made. So it doesn't matter what, if it's an expensive watch or if it's a very inexpensive watch, the thought process in going into that design is something that I want to understand, something that I want to break down why the particular watchmaker did this thing this way. And part of understanding that, even if I don't ask them that question directly, why did you do this way, is to explore it with my lens. So what I do at first is explore a watch with my lens, and really that's how I get intimate with it. And that's how I get an understanding before maybe even understanding the marketing speak that the brand is trying to get across with it. So when I look at those details and the client says, "Here, do your thing," and I look at those details and get them back those particular things that they would have already highlighted if they hadn't told me to do so, that's where there's a being a watch aficionado, a watch collector, really brings me to the next level with those clients because they don't have to question whether or not I understand why it's important that they made that part of that watch that way. I just get excited when I find out because I'm looking through my lens and I'm like, I turn to them and say, "Oh, you did it this way because X, Y, or Z." And they're like, "Yeah, you get it." And so because there's that level of understanding, I am fortunate that I get to have my job be photography, which is a thing that I love doing. I like a specific, type of physical object. I like mechanical objects. I like, I'm big into bicycles, mechanical cameras. And for me, being able to marry those two and have that be my career, my job, has helped inspire my regular photography, my commercial work to expand into artistic variations on commercial work.
I love it. It's like you were in my head when you were going off on that whole description because it's really it's like I'm thinking like watches are like watch. I got a timepiece right there on my arm because it's like watches.
Cool.
They just I don't know. There's something deeper to them. The meaning they like throughout history, they've always carried this deep importance that you so eloquently reflected there. And it's like that's something that you do want to bring in. And it isn't just about a product at that point. It really is. It's a story, it's a history, it's a narrative. And it's so hard sometimes to bring narratives into product photography. So I'm kind of interested. What are the things, the creative decisions that are made? Like, how do you bring narrative? Knowing all this stuff is one thing, but then incorporating it and relaying that to the viewer is another thing, and that can be difficult. So do you have any tips, or is there something that you kind of lean on for bringing that narrative and putting it into practice?
That's a good question. It's kind of understanding everything you can about the client that you're working with, right?
Mhm.
Because some clients are just like, we made this beautiful product and it should speak for itself. Bring that to it. These are the special details. I see this with, okay, so there are a few different places around the world that manufacture watches. Of course, there's Switzerland. That's the main place that watches are currently created. Um, there's um, and there's Germany and there's Japan. And there's a region in Germany, and the Germans have a different outlook on the way they do their watches as the Swiss or the Japanese. And of course, there's other places around the world. British watchmaking is coming back. United States watchmaking is attempting to make a comeback. But the the Germans are very much, you know, very straightforward. They want their watches to be very specific, and it's less about necessarily being beauty for beauty's sake and being very um, focused on this is the best and straightforwardest way to tell time. And their idea of marketing is different than the other people's marketing from the Swiss people's marketing, the Swiss French marketing. And it's like it's really interesting to go across those different dynamics and understand where it is that the people are coming from and what their culture is about. Um, I went to Japan in 2022 to photograph the 40th anniversary book for Casio G-Shock, and it was my first time in Japan. So being in Japan was really integral to getting the types of shots and letting those inspire, letting that place, the culture inspire what I was going to be presenting with my photography of their products, right? So I would say that understanding where your client is coming from as far as culturally in the world and what their outlooks are is a big thing to helping inform you to do your photography at its most creative, but in the way that works for them.
I love that. And mention the G-Shock. I know we have some images that so I think I've never wanted to pull up images so fast. I'm like this whole time I'm like I want it. There's such good work. So I'm going to pull up some images now.
Okay.
While I'm doing that, I got to throw out the question, as anyone who's done product knows, retouching could be such a pain in the ass. And no matter how sanitized the setting is, what is the workspace like? I'm just sitting there and I'm like, man, are you just sitting there in like a confined space with, a dust blower? And how much can you? It's like no matter how much you get dust out of there, you always get something on there.
Always, always, always. There are tricks to removing, the dust prior to photographing, but when you're photographing macro, there's going to be dust and debris that you had no idea was there, and you might not even retouch if you just zoomed out a little bit, right?
Mhm.
But when you're getting that close, you also add more work for yourself unless you try and get rid of it in camera beforehand, right? By in camera, I mean doing it on set. So as much as you can do ahead of time to reduce that, the better. There's different ways you can use air canisters. Um, I there's lots of different blowers that I have. There's even devices that I have that will get rid of electrical charge on set that to
Wow.
remove to try and reduce static electricity. Just because static electricity, brings the dust will adhere to an object if there's a static charge in the air. It's so when you blow the dust away and then it floats up and it's going to come right back down and statically charge right back to your object. So, there's ways to try and get around that. And, having my own studio, you can control the environment as much as you can. But especially when you go on site, it's like you just got to expect that you're going to be doing a bunch of retouching.
Yeah, you already know it's in the cards for that. I'm gonna pull these images back up and I'm gonna leave the sidebar up here
Sure.
just so we can kind of bounce around these. But we have some G-Shock images here. Can you take us
Yeah,
through these
yeah.
images?
Yeah, so these are were shot for the 40th anniversary G-Shock book, which came out in 2023 at the end of the year. And it was we have the founder of G-Shock up on the right-hand side there. That's Kikuo Ibe, Mr. Ibe. And I love photographing people. I really do. But I found out early on from working in the fashion world in New York City that that's not how I wanted to take my photography in a professional way. So when I get the opportunity to photograph people, it's in a bit of a different way than than the way that I understand and came up in the world of fashion photography as an assistant here in New York City. So I love when I get the opportunity to photograph, uh, you know, a watchmaker or a CEO of a brand, somebody like that. And it was really fantastic to see that they used some of those images in the book. Um, the bottom right image there is one of the original G-Shocks from the early 80s. And as you can see, that's one of the watches that I couldn't remove from Japan. That was like this is in the archives and it can't be removed from this our headquarters. So I had to photograph it in a room there. But I also got an opportunity to go into their manufacturing facilities. And in the bottom left image there is the molds that you would use for the watch that's right above it there. And it was great because they had this idea to do these exploded views of some of their watches, and I basically was like, okay, send me disassemble a bunch of watches and send them to me, and I'll photograph the parts. And then I made these layouts, and that was all me making the layouts. They were like, this is the client basically said, we want original photography for this project. We don't want to necessarily just rehash all the marketing that we've done in the past. So we want this to be represented by, your vision of what you see in this brand. So it was like the biggest, most comprehensive look inside of a watch brand that I'd done so far, which is really awesome.
That's awesome. Here's some more images here.
And always, anyone watching this, I would always say, when you're on set and you've got this idea, to make it happen, to do it. So the image on the top right there, as I was photographing in Japan, they had all of the cases themselves that were, just essentially the the front of the case for the standard watch that they make the most of. And they had all these different colors, and I was photographing them individually, and I thought to myself, I've got a better idea for this. And I asked to get as many as I could to take home with me that night into my hotel room. And I just laid them all out on the desk, and I basically created a studio in my hotel room and made this concept of just stacking all of the different designs, different colors on top of each other. And they ended up using it in the book. So you never know when you're on set, when you have a big project, do creative things and present those things to your client, because you never know what they're going to end up using. And it was, a concept that I never intended. I never thought they would necessarily use it because, there were so many different amazing images, but they ended up using it. So it was
That's
awesome.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of cool. It gives you the leeway. Do you go into it like, okay, I'm gonna get stuff that I know they'll like, the kind of standard issue stuff, and then it's time to play once I have that stuff? Is that how you approach it?
Yeah, yeah. This project was wild because they were like, I not only had to shoot hundreds of watches on a studio kind of setup because they wanted to have all these different watches represented, but they also wanted this creative thing, like these layouts here on the left with laying this all out and exploding the view. But then they wanted me to get in comprehensively and do these macro shots that were, and somebody might not think that a G-Shock might be interesting in macro, but really everything can be interesting in macro, especially with when somebody has a unique way of creating something like the Kith watch on the bottom right there with this rainbow metal case that they heat treat in order to get this wild, unique. Every watch is unique. So
That's
it's
awesome.
there's so much about everything. Sometimes people ask me, what my favorite watch to photograph is, and I always just tell them that it's whatever's in front of my lens right now because every watch is interesting to me.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, but I was gonna say, what's the holy grail for you? Is there one piece, not even just to shoot, to wear? Is there one piece that stands out for you?
Um, I tend to gravitate in my personal collection to interestingly designed, out of the box type of watches. Uh, there's a brand called MB&F, which stands for Max Busser and Friends, and their designs basically look like weird little spaceships. And, and those some of them are far outside of my price range. Most of all of them are far outside of my price range um, because they can cost as much as a house. And
Wow,
for me, it's like those might be Grail watches, but also one of my current Grail watches is made by a watch brand, RGM, which stands for Roland G. Murphy. He's out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I'm a big baseball fan, and he does a watch that uses a enamel, like a traditional enamel dial technique. Enamel dials you would have seen on pocket watches in the 1800s and things like that. And he uses that same enamel fired technique to get this white dial, but instead of the numbers on the dial, he has these baseball players. Because at some point in,
so
I,
cool.
I don't know, I think it was Elgin, made it might have been Waltham. Anyway, somebody made a pocket watch like this, a one-off, or maybe there was a few of them with these little baseball players on them. And Roland Murphy makes a version of that. Um, and as I'm a big baseball fan, and opening day is actually coming up at the end of March, it's like that is my personal Grail watch that maybe one day I could afford.
That's awesome. Yankees fan or
I grew up as a Yankees fan, but my grandmother got me into baseball, and I'm a Reds fan because my family's from Cincinnati. So I'm going to
okay.
Cincinnati for opening day.
I respect that. I respect that. All right, here we go. Some macro images here. Beautiful, beautiful.
Yep.
It's the lighting and just everything. I mean, composition, obviously, it makes it stand out, but I don't think people really appreciate how hard it is to get the lighting just right. I'm looking bottom left corner there,
Mhm.
and it's just the way that the shadows, the highlights, the way the face is just the color pops. It's beautiful.
There's so many details, and like I was saying earlier, understanding the way that watches are made, understanding the intention from the watchmaker. So that image on the bottom left, they have this, they call it like a coin edge bezel there, where it's all the way around, sort of looks like a coin edge, and it's that's the thing they wanted me to highlight in that image, and it was like understanding why that's important to them is part of getting straight to what the client wants, immediately without them having to question or push you in a certain direction. So the more you can understand about what it is that you're trying to capture, um, and if you happen to love the subject matter, it doesn't hurt either, right? So
Hmm. Totally. Now I got to ask about the time. I see 10:10 or 10:09.
short, yep.
What is there relevance to that? And does that change depending on when you're shooting, or how do you decide what time it's going to be?
So 1010 is definitely a standard 10-10-35. And
Okay.
usually it's not actually 10-10 because the reason that you have the hands in that position is commonly understood to have none of the logos on the dial blocked, because
Okay.
usually the logos would be at the top and at the bottom of the dial in the center. So if you have your hands set to that particular, way every time, you're likely not going to be blocking it. Now, some brands have sort of this is not like a hard and fast rule. Many brands have a specific look that they prefer instead of that, but it also gives a nice symmetry to the way the watches look. So that's a default unless somebody asks me not to.
Interesting. 10:10:35. That's going to come up in some like random bar trivia. And I never would have thought of that. Oh, I love these.
So we're getting a little more macro in some of these. The one in the very center on the top there is actually an American-made pocket watch from the early 1800s. And I'm involved with the Horological Society of New York, and they have a library where they do watch exhibitions, mostly of old pocket watches. And so that was an image that I took for one of their exhibitions. Actually, it's a current exhibition here in New York. Um, so it goes back to what I was saying earlier about, the old history of time, the history of pocket watches. Really what it is what's amazing about modern timepieces is not that they've come up with different ways of telling time, because every modern what they call them complications. A complication is something beyond time. So if you have like a moon phase, or in the top right image there, you have literally the celestial bodies of our solar system, which move in real time. So, but it's like beyond. There's this. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Exactly what I was trying to bring up, but the different things that can be made. Oh, there it is. Sorry. The
Mhm.
different things that are made in modern watches is only really interesting because they've miniaturized it so much. Because pocket watches of old are like, let's say like 2 inches in diameter, and they're very thick. So they have a lot more space to make all of these interesting complications and to do all these, highfalutin perpetual calendars and things like that that tell you even the leap year, mechanically. Um, but the modern watch being part of the reason I need to do macro photography with watches is because as the time has gone on and brands have made them smaller and smaller and thinner, and that in itself is an interesting technical aspect to explore with my lens.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like I don't think I've realized how intricate these are, and that's the beauty of the macro. It really brings out the intricacies. And in my head, it's like, man, there's some smart people out there, smarter than I'll ever be in 10 lifetimes, and just the ingenuity of some of these pieces. I mean, I'm looking at the bottom right. What are we looking at in the bottom right there?
So that's a a tourbillon, and a tourbillon is a type of watch movement that. So if you can imagine, if you're a gentleman dandy in the 1800s, and you have a pocket watch, because that's what the fashion of the day is what the men would have a pocket watch, women as well, and you'd put it in your pocket and it would sit in one position, right? It would sit all day long in your pocket in one position. Now, over time, gravity will pull down on all of the parts, and it will warp things, and it will not run accurately. So a watchmaker designed, um, uh, actually Breguet designed a mechanism called a tourbillon that rotates the mechanism as it functions. So the point of that would be, when the watch is sitting in your pocket in one position, you're continuing to have an accurate piece. Modern day watches have taken the mechanical tourbillon, and it takes quite amount of precision and technical know-how to create it. So as it's miniaturized and gotten smaller and smaller in standard watches, they've been able to make these beautiful mechanical objects. This particular one is actually a multi-axis tourbillon, so it's going not only this way, but it's also going this way. So
Wow,
it as that mechanical watch functions, that whole thing is essentially a gyroscope inside of the watch itself.
insane. I'm guessing that one's a little out of my price range. Maybe just a little. All right.
Okay,
This I've been waiting to get to this one because I know you get the show and tell today, and we got some stories here. Talk to us about these pieces.
okay. So these are all artworks created in Photoshop based on commercial watch photography that I did. So as I was hanging out with these watch collectors in these dark bars in New York City, I had someone come to me and said, "Oh, I run a vintage watch dealership, and my photographer's out of town. Will you come and photograph?" Turns out I ended up getting hired by this company. that analog shift that now, they were like, okay, I worked there for 4 years and they were like, here's all of these vintage watches. And I got this great education in understanding vintage watches. And by vintage watches, I mean prior to the 1990s. So before 1990 would be a vintage watch. And, the current American understanding of vintage watches is about the 1930s to the late 80s. That's like a vintage watch. And as I was photographing these same types of watches over and over again, I would shoot, you know, so take the image on the top in the center there. That's the bezel on the exterior part of the watch here, the bezel on the Rolex GMT Master. And they made these different variations with different colors. So over time, I photographed hundreds of these different of the same model, but with a different variation that's over time changed color because of, the life that it's lived. So I started exploring this on my own with just taking the elements of the watches that were interesting to me and putting them together in these artistic formats. And this was early days of Instagram, and I started posting them there. And people really started going, what am I looking at? The one on the top right, people are like, is this a real watch? How do you wear that? I don't understand. And so, like it started to sort of play with people's understandings of what watch photography could be. So I took that and I extrapolated. I created art with my commercial work because I already saw these different elements of watches that I enjoyed and I enjoyed exploring. And I took those elements and like the watch on the top right was a British military watch. And to denote that it's from the British military, they would put this arrow on it. But 12 different manufacturers made watches for the British military, and they all put a different arrow. There was no standardization because this was in World War II. So as long as there was this arrow, it denoted that it was British military. So I took these different designs. They all have the same case shape and size and hands basically. And the main thing that was different was this arrow. So I took these arrows and I created this art piece. And I eventually I had a show here in New York. That was my first watch only art show, based on these creations that I made, these mashups. I call them mashups because I'm taking watch parts and mashing them together in Photoshop to make these, you know, different variations, these unseen things.
That's so cool. I gotta pull the shared screen down for a moment because I know you got the watch. I want to see the watch,
Okay, so
the
behind me here,
arrow.
you see one of the prints, and I do these prints on metal, just because it sort of makes sense, watches in metal. So also I eventually, actually Roland Murphy from our GM came to me and said, have you ever thought about doing an actual watch based on your artwork? And I said all the time, but I haven't had the opportunity to really do it. And he said, well, let's create one. Let's do it. I want to. So
That's so
um,
awesome.
at the end of 2023, I created the Fat Arrow watch with Roland. Hopefully it's in focus there. That was took you know the photography of watches, went to an art piece, and then to a physical watch. So it's like this meta kind of thing.
Right?
And I call myself sometimes an accidental watch designer because this was not on purpose. I didn't set out to become a watch designer, but you know what? I could be a watch designer. There's a lot to think
Totally.
about when looking at and designing watches. So I'm very fortunate that I was able to do this limited edition with Roland Murphy at our GM.
That's about as badass as it gets. Most people, it's like, a publisher comes to you and is like, "Hey, we love your work," or a gallery, "We'd love to exhibit your work." It's like, "Hey, you want to design a watch?" That's awesome. That's next level.
So there's a little bit okay, we're looking at plants now. Um, in the macro world, there my understanding of plant photography, I had this cliched idea of what somebody who takes plant photography is. And to me, this was ingrained in me when I was a teenager and started doing photography. And I was like, oh, people who photograph flowers, that's just like a hobbyist photography, you know, thing that you would, of course, photograph because flowers are, quote unquote, inherently beautiful or whatever. And, it's a subject matter you might want to photograph. But as life moved forward and I became enamored with macro photography in the macro world, I started going to this garden very close to my house where I live in the Bronx called Wave Hill. And well, at first it was just going there because it's a beautiful place and their gardens are constantly blooming. And I started bringing my camera and looking at the plants in a macro way, which I hadn't done before. And it's a completely different kind of photography when you are in a non-controlled environment. Like it's outside and there's wind and everything's moving and you have to really think a little bit harder about your technique. And that getting outside of the box of being in the studio and photographing products in the studio was really uh, kind of an inspiration for me. And I started creating these images that I was like in love with, like all of these tiny elements and getting closer and closer and closer to almost to a microscopic level is like is very fascinating to me. Um, so this, of course, might translate into our next thing. Of course, I've got the art that I created with watch parts and put them together. And now I've been exploring this plant photography. And so my current exhibition that I have up um, is taking these images of plants from Wave Hill and the watch photography that I've been doing for years and years and putting those together. And the exhibition is called Second Nature, and it's currently up at my alma mater up in Massachusetts. I was tapped by them to do an alumni show to bring my work there. And actually, a few weeks ago, I taught some workshops to the students there, and I gave a lecture. Um, and I really, it's fascinating the way that it made me think about my own understanding of my own art to, okay, give workshops to students, tell them what it is you do with your macro photography from commercial world and from your, artistic lifestyle being the plants and putting these things together. Um, and why do you do that, right? Like, and for me, it really boiled down to process of this creation. For me, creating these artworks, taking the images are things that I just love doing anyway, either commercially or just with the watches, getting the chance to explore these things that, some people may not get a chance to have in their hand, and then taking those things and crossing them over with nature. Now, of course, this might go back to the earlier discussion about the beginning of man's understanding of keeping time is, nature is constantly moving. Nature is, moving forward no matter what. Time is marching forward and it's its own way of keeping time. If you're in a garden, you can see the way that the world moves on. Plants bloom and die and reproduce and crossing that with man's understanding of time and the watches that they create to show that you know flawed understanding of what time is. This is just an understanding that our brains like to pick up on. Taking those things and putting watch parts and plants together and mashing those up, that process of doing that taking those things, because I'd explored the watch parts and watch parts together, I'd explored that quite a lot. And I was looking for an evolution of that, and this is where I ended up.
This is such an awesome evolution of it. It's like it is. It's the perfect marriage. And look, with your design skills and just the technical attention to detail, it's like I don't know what's real, what's not. What's a real watch? What's a watch you created out of thin air?
That's
Beautiful, beautiful work.
so you'll see that, thank you. You'll see that I do present here like this is the way that this looks on the wall in the exhibition, is that I have the art print and I have the prints that go along that created that. And one of not it's not to like hit people over the head with like understanding what that is, but it's almost that I would have shown the two images on the left there, the original images. I could have shown those by themselves on the wall.
Yeah.
But I kind of want to I want to show my work in a way because I want to share those aspects of it. And not everybody understands watches. So sometimes if I just show the watch on the image on the right, the art piece, yes, it could make people kind of question what they're seeing, but I enjoy getting from the original images to that. And if I can have somebody in their own mind take whatever they want from seeing that, because of course, you can't tell people how to feel about the images they're looking at. They get to see where I started and where it ended up, and they can get there with their own minds. They can create in their own heads. So maybe that'll inspire somebody else to do something outside of their normal artistic box, whatever that may be.
Yeah, I think that's such a cool way to display. And we talk about it all the time when we look at images. And, normally it's in discussion of sequencing for putting the book together or an exhibition, but it really matters what images are next to each other, what images are paired together. And I think this triptych style here is so beautiful. It's like, yes, all three of them individually are art in and of themselves, which I think is awesome. But when you see them all together and see how it comes together, and it's still this simplified version, it's not like you're, really complicating things here. It is cool to see this how they come together. But
And
it's
and I appreciate you saying it's simplified. The art pieces themselves, if you go to the one with the chain, I think it's three images up there. Yep. Um, Simplified is one way to put it, but the process of creating the art piece on this one was zooming in 400% and like
I was gonna say it
masking
was giving me
things.
a headache trying to. I was looking and I'm like, man, this gives me a headache just thinking about the retouching.
But it's for me that process, that creation of it, that taking these images that I've already created, whether it be the watches and the plants, and going through my archives of those things and putting them together and playing with what might work with what is part of the thing that makes me want to do this. I could not show these to anyone and just have them be for me, and I would be fine with that. Because the creation, the creative process of doing it is where I get the real satisfaction. And
Mm.
that's not something I understood that was going to happen from this, right? Like I wanted to explore taking my watch photography and making art with it just because that's it. I like to take things and twist them a little bit. And macro photography is kind of that. It's seeing something that's unseen in a way sometimes. So taking these images and twisting them together, I didn't understand how good it was going to be for my brain. And maybe this comes from, the last 5 years and the turmoil of the world and pandemic and that sort of thing. But this has been a creative outlet that I've really been fortunate to find.
I love that. And I love what you said. It's about you and the whole process. And a lot of times we get so caught up in not even just the results, in the reaction to the results. We become so
Mhm.
fixated on, well, people have to appreciate my work and my work has to be seen by everyone. It's like, no, can we get back to the artistic process of creating work that we want to create, creating work that makes us feel good and enjoying the act of the creation, which I think here it's like, yeah, this is something. It's like I love to throw on some classical music in my headphones and kind of go off into a zone and see where my creativity takes me.
Absolutely.
Wow, Adam, can't thank you enough, man. This was such a good
Thank you.
conversation. These are the times where I wish I knew more about watches. I'm like, man, I feel like somebody
It's
out
been a
there is
journey.
in the audience, like, man, I want to know this and I want to know this. But it's super fascinating, and your passion for it is it really comes through in these images.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. I enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to seeing your work all over. What's the next steps? You got anything in the works? Is any exhibitions, anything set up?
Um, I am so the garden where I photographed all of the plants, and for some reason I just have all gravitated entirely to Wave Hill to photograph the plants. Um, it turns out that the executive director of Wave Hill is a watch guy.
Oh, no
Um,
way.
yeah, I didn't know this at first. I had no affiliation with them before, but now it's Wave Hill's 60th anniversary, and I've become an ambassador for Wave Hill. So my next project is something um, in collaboration with them this year. So this year or next year or sometime in the near future. So you can look out for that.
That's awesome. Congratulations on that. That's
Thank you.
huge. I love Wave Hill. You just reminded me that I don't think I've brought my son there since he was a baby. So yes, I'm overdue for a Wave Hill trip right over there across Broadway and up the highway a little bit. But
Awesome.
for all you out there in the New York metro area, check out Wave Hill. If you haven't already, Adam, I'm going to keep an eye out on that because I'd love to go check out anything that you are
For
working
sure.
on with them. Huge congrats to you again, and thank you for your time and expertise. And of course, to all of our viewers out there, thank you for tuning in. Extra special thank you to Leica for hosting today's event. That is it. Another episode of the B&H Event Space, Leica Stories in the Books. Catch y'all next time.